All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Big Three here at CPA TV. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and alongside my co-host and fellow economist Andrew Rechenberg, together we are here to talk to you about the big three topics happening in international trade this week. But before we get to that, we wanted to talk to you about the big three, kind of give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about for this episode. So the first topic on the agenda today is talking about China's export growth stalling. So Andrew, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just as a general update for the U.S.-China trade war, China's leverage is really quickly deteriorating. And this is because over the past 20 years, they've really had an economic model that is over-reliant on export growth, and specifically export growth to the U.S. And so as the U.S. is cutting off supply, their export growth has slowed to the slowest level in 6 months. Their industrial capacity utilization rate, how much the factories are producing, has dropped to 74%, the lowest since COVID. And in addition to that, their export prices are now actually falling in order to remain competitive with U.S. tariffs. All of this is really a sign of weakness and over-reliance on exports, and this is also a weakness for us because we're reliant on their subsidized exports. And so, moving on to the second topic, also sticking with China, is China's rare earths and how they have this overstated leverage. And Mihir, I think you can talk about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting when you look at how the story is played out about China's industrial prowess in so many sectors and critical minerals, rare earth magnets, etc. They dominate the mining of that and the mining and refining of those critical technologies that we rely on for imports. But as they've applied these export controls and they've increasingly resorted to that, they've weaponized their dominance over those supply chains. They're actually unwittingly creating an incentive for the U.S. and other Western economies to start mining and refining themselves and trying to increase their availability or their ability to access those supplies. So I think China is actually overplaying their hand a little bit, and that was just what my article was talking about. And then the number three topic on the agenda today is talking about the tariffs that were unveiled this past week on trucks, pharmaceuticals, and machinery. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Andrew?
Yeah, so the Trump administration has announced a 100% tariff on brand name pharmaceuticals, with the exception of Europe and Japan, which will stay at the capped 15% due to our trade agreements, and with the exception of companies building in the U.S. In addition to that, there's going to be a 25% tariff on heavy trucks and a 30 to 50% tariff on furniture and cabinets. All of this is a really good development. The Trump administration is doing the right thing by prioritizing industry-specific tariffs, and this is really what we need. We're at a really crisis, especially for pharmaceuticals. We've lost a huge market share. We used to be at an 84% domestic market share for pharmaceuticals. Now we're at 37%. And so this is really a crisis that we need to address. And we need to realize that the world does not want to buy from the U.S. The world wants to sell to the U.S. And so we need to protect our domestic producers in order to do that.
All right. Well, we just wrapped up the big three. So let's get to the actual meat of the analysis. Let's get to it. So the first topic we wanted to get into in a little bit more detail is talking about China's export growth stalling. And so, Andrew, why don't you talk us through a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the numbers?
Yeah, so as I stated before, China has a huge over-reliance on exporting, specifically to the United States. They've diversified a little bit in recent years by exporting more to Southeast Asia or to Europe, but the U.S. always remains the biggest prize, and it's also the prize that's pushing back the hardest in recent years. And so this is going to be a huge vulnerability for China, this dependence on the U.S., and this is also going to be something that is going to mute the effect of the U.S. tariffs. China's going to have to continuously subsidize and underprice their goods under their true value in order to remain competitive in the U.S. market. And they're so over-reliant on the U.S. market that they're willing to do this. They're willing to cut these prices. They're willing to take the burden of the tariffs in order to remain competitive. But this still is going to help U.S. producers. It's not going to be completely made up in whole prices, but it just shows that China is really vulnerable in this area. They're losing their industrial capacity utilization rate. That's falling, lowest level since COVID. And this basically means that they're producing less and less of what they could be producing. The factories are not running on 100% as much as they were. And this is because there's just not as much of that demand in the global market. It's being shaken up by US producers, European producers, and this is dependence on exports for China is a real vulnerability of theirs, just as much as our over reliance on imports from China is a vulnerability for us.
Yeah, I think these 232s have really given us the opportunity to show everybody just how unbalanced our trading relationship has been, and really kind of draws attention to the dysfunction in China's economy, frankly. I mean, ever since their real estate sector went bust over the past 5 years or so, we've seen just the collapsing of domestic demand. And the Chinese government has done very little to ensure and promote consumption in their country because as you say, their an entire model is just based on exporting to the US. And so because we're beginning to turn off that spigot, they're then beginning to dump their wares onto the other, other countries in the world. And those countries are starting to now initiate trade related actions, launching their own kind of investigations, sort of similar to what we do with our 301s, our anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and things like that. So I actually think this is working in our favor. Our trade policies are beginning to really show a light on just how dysfunctional China's system has been, and disruptive it's been to global trade. I guess for the second topic, we wanted to talk, just keeping with in the theme of China. Recently, I just wrote a letter to the editor of the Financial Times talking about this very issue. There's been this question about China having all this dominance over global supply chains and so many sectors, whether it's textiles or whether it's high tech manufacturing, whether it's renewable energies. And one sector in particular that gets a lot of attention recently is the rare earth minerals and critical, rare earth magnets and critical minerals that China has a dominance on supplying on the supply chain, whether it's refining and mining. My article was essentially just talking about, well, like really push back on the fact that China is weaponizing or succeeding in their ability to weaponize their dominance over that supply chain, in putting up export controls of those critical minerals, because it's actually encouraging the U.S. and other Western partners to find ways about how to reduce their reliance on Chinese rare earths and critical minerals in their supply chains, whether it's for automotive technologies or anything else. And we're also beginning to find more ways to try to work with our allies to get more access to those supplies. We're also trying to find ways that we can bring more mines, rare earth mines online. So I actually don't think that China is succeeding in their ability to weaponize their supply chains and their dominance for critical minerals at this moment. The third topic
I think that this is such a critical point that China actually has a relatively weak position here, and it's largely because their leverage is a short-term problem that the U.S. has. We don't have short-term availability. We don't have enough capacity right now for these rare earths. This is a short-term problem that we have. But China's problem is a long-term problem. They don't have this technologically capability developed over time, this know-how for a lot of these advanced manufacturing industries. And we do. We have this technological innovation, and China's desperately trying to catch up. But this is something you build over the very long term. With the rare earth problem, we might not have this capacity right now, but we know how to develop it. We know where resources are. It takes time to develop, but this is achievable for us. For China, it's a lot harder of a goal. And so this is a huge advantage the U.S. has. And it's something that, as you're pointing out, that we are actively actually taking advantage of. We're using this opportunity to invest more in these rare earths, these magnets. The Trump administration and the DoD recently announced a $400 million mine-to-magnet program to actually build our domestic supply chain. And the Trump administration also announced a Section 232 investigation for these critical minerals. And so it's actively encouraging us to undermine China's leverage. And I think that that's a really critical point, that we're moving in the right direction. We're throwing off these chains.
Yeah, no, that's all well said. And then I think for our final topic, wanted to pivot to the tariffs that were recently unveiled on trucks, pharmaceuticals, and machinery. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there?
Yeah, so the Trump administration has recently announced a wave of different tariffs on different sectors. So we have 100% on brand name pharmaceutical drugs. These largely come from European countries. Those are the biggest exporters to the US. But Europe and Japan are going to be capped at a 15% tariff due to the trade deal that we made with these countries. And the rest of them, there's a planned 100% tariff on these pharmaceutical products. And so in essence, this is going to create a bit of a tiered system where US drugs are prioritized. If you're building factories here in the US, or if you are making these drugs in the US, it's going to be zero tariff. And then the second tier is going to be the European Union and Japan at 15%, and the rest of the world at 100%. And so that's currently the plan with these brand name pharmaceutical drugs. Additionally, we have the duty on heavy trucks. This is set to be at around 25%. And then additionally, we have furniture and cabinets at around 30 to 50%, depending on the product. And all of these are very critical, but I think that the most critical development here is the pharmaceutical side. We're looking at a finalization sometime soon of the Trump administration's Section 232 investigation on generic pharma. And this is where the real crisis lies. These generic drugs that are 90% of US prescriptions, these cheaper drugs that most Americans use just for everyday medications, these are especially dominated by India and China, both for the base pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs, and the actual final drug production, which more happens in India than China. About 50% of our supply comes from India for these final import supply for the finished drug supply for generic drugs. And so this is a real crisis point for us. It's caused a lot of shortages just due to the problems it's caused for domestic producers. We have a real supply problem here in the US where it's not profitable to make generic drugs where it is in India. And it's leading to shortages at hospitals and becoming a huge crisis for us. And I think we really need to realize how we got here. We got here because we once had a great manufacturing industry for pharmaceuticals. We used to have about a 87% market share for 80% of the drugs made in the US. Consumed in the US were made in the US. Now it's around 37%. And so this is a dramatic fall off, and it's because we assumed that we could export to the world. We can remain competitive with all these different countries, but these countries don't play by the same rules. They subsidize, they cut corners, they dump products in the US, and they don't want to buy our products. They want to sell to us. We're the world's biggest market. And we really need a mental change here, which is, I think, what's happening. We need to protect our own producers, guarantee safety for consumers, and make sure that patients come first, and make sure we have a stable domestic supply.
Yeah, one thing I want to really quickly point out is just that I want to see the details on these tariffs that once they finally are implemented. So, for example, I don't want to see just that like name brand drugs by multinational corporations are the ones that are subject to tariffs per se. And I want to see obviously that like they're going to be capturing the generics in that policy proposal. And then the other question I have about the trucks is that most of what we're importing is coming from Canada and Mexico, and if those countries are able to demonstrate that like the content that they are exporting to the U.S. has a substantial or meets that local content requirement for being made within the U.S. or excuse me within the North American region, then they can be exempt from those tariffs. That's something we don't want to deal with. So that's where I think the USMCA, renegotiations or some of they're beginning to talk about like the USMCA beginning in the next, I think in the next few months, they're talking about like the implications of the USMCA and talking about where there are gaps and loopholes that need to be closed. That would definitely be something that we'd want to talk about addressing. But yeah, no, this was a great conversation as always, Andrew. Wanted to thank you all for joining us for another episode of The Big Three on CPA TV, and hope you can join us next week when we will be talking about the next big three topics happening next week. So look to see you then. Thank you.